In this video, we're going to take a quick look at the float property and the clear property in CSS. I have a basic HTML page set up with a little bit of information from Wikipedia about the capybara. I have an H1 followed by an image, a paragraph, an H3, and a couple other paragraphs. And let's see what that looks like if we open it up in the browser. You can see that everything just stacks. Now, almost all of these elements are block elements by default. So the H1, the paragraphs, and the H2 are all block elements, meaning they want to stack by default. The image is an inline element, meaning that it will sit next to other inline elements, but because it's sitting next to block elements, it just gets stacked with everything else. But a common effect in publishing layout is to have text wrap around the side of an image. And we want to achieve that with CSS. So to do that, we're going to use the float property. Now I have my image here, and you can see I've absolutely linked the image. Of course, if this was a real project, you would want to download an image and make sure that it was in your local directory structure. But for the purposes of this demo, I've just used an absolutely linked image. And I have my alt here, which is alternative information for if the image isn't viewable for whatever reason. And I'm going to add a class because I don't want every image that might be somewhere else on this imaginary website to float. I want just this image to float. So I'm going to name this something like article image. Okay, so class article image. Now I'm going to go into my CSS and I'm going to select for that class. So dot article image. Remember, dot refers to a class. So our class here is article image. So we've called it with dot article image. And now in here, I'm going to use the float property. We can use a directional value like left or right. So let's say I want this image to sit on the left side of the page and the text to wrap around it to the right. So that being the case, I'm going to use float left. You can see that all the text is wrapping around it to the right. We can clean this up in a minute, but let's see what the other possibilities are. If we wanted the image to instead sit on the right-hand side of the container and everything to wrap around it to the left, well, by that same token, we could use float right. And here we can see that's working and everything wraps around it to the left side. And we can see that that will reflow as I resize the page so that everything keeps wrapping around it to the left side. The only other value that I might want to do for the float property is none. And that basically means if there are any floats, turn them off. So you might have a situation where you've floated some elements, but then you want to turn off just one of them or something like that. And you could use float none. I'm going to return to our first one, float left, for this layout. So here we have it back on the left. And one of the issues we can see here is that it gets a little bit hard to read this text that's right up against the image. Well, we can use our old friend margin to add a little space around the image. And looking at this, I can see that I want space on the right and on the bottom. I could do this a few ways, but I'm going to use margin shorthand, and I'm going to use 4-value shorthand, which means we go around clockwise starting at the top. So I'm going to say 0 on the top, 1 rem on the right, 1 rem on the bottom, and 0 on the left. And let's see how that looks. Okay, that's nice. We got a little bit of space there, a little bit of breathing room. And we can see again, as I resize this, the text will reflow based on how much space I have. So that's basically what floats are for. We used to use floats for layout type stuff, but it's really not designed for that, and it's not very good for that. The main thing you should use floats for is just a situation like this, where you have an image, or you could use this on any other kind of element. You have a little block and you want some text to wrap around it. So this is cool, but we can see here that I have this new section, introduction, that started with this H2 here. And what if I didn't want this to wrap around the image? I only wanted the paragraph before it to wrap around the image. And we can see if I move this paragraph, then that also wraps around the image. But I'm going to shorten this paragraph a little bit, take some of the content out, so we can see again how not only do the paragraphs wrap around it, but the H2 wraps around it. What if I didn't want this H2 to wrap around? What if I wanted it to be pushed below the floated object? So the floated object is the image. I'm going to need a way to tell it, hey, don't respect any floats, don't wrap. And that is what the other property I mentioned before, clear, is for. So I'm going to select this H2, And I'm going to invoke that clear property. Now, with clear, we need to tell it which direction the float we're trying to ignore is on. So right now we floated it to the left. We have our image floated to the left. So if I want the H2 to not wrap around that, I'm going to have to tell it clear left. And then I can look in the browser and I can see that that H2 is no longer wrapping around the image. It's been pushed to below it. And that's what clear does. It says, hey, if you otherwise would be wrapping around something that's floated, don't do that. Go below it. It's pushing itself away from that floated object. But again, it has to match. So we said clear left, the float is to the left, so that worked. If we said clear right, and our float is to the left, well, that's not going to work. And you can see this is still wrapping. But if we make it match the other way, if we say float right, so now our float is to the right and our clear is to the right, our clear is working again. Let me put these back to the left. We can see it's working again. Sometimes you want to clear everything that's been floated, whether it's on the right or the left, or you just don't know that in every situation you know which direction the element that comes before is going to be floated. In that case, you can just say clear both. And that's going to clear something that's floated to the left or something that's floated to the right. And we can see that still works. And then finally, just as with float, we could also do a value of none if we just wanted to turn off any clear that was already there. But that's a pretty rare situation. So for most situations when I'm using a clear, I just do clear both. And that way I can know that whatever came before it, whether it was floated to the left or floated to the right, my element is going to push down below it and not wrap around it with the rest of the text that's wrapping around it. So that's it. That's clear and float. Float will push an element either to the left side of the page or the right side of the page, and it'll cause whatever text comes after it or whatever content comes after it to wrap around it on the other side. Clear basically just tells an element, don't wrap around a thing that's floated that you would otherwise wrap around. And the value of clear should either match the value in the float that you're trying to clear, or you should use both, in which case it will clear every float and not wrap around any floated object that came before. That's clear and float.